I will then open the next paper, please, and that's by Giacomo Candian. Giacomo is an associate professor in HEC Montreal, and he'll be presenting a paper on uncertainty through the production network, which is joint work with Matteo Cacciatore. Giacomo, please, you have 25 minutes.
Thank you for this nice introduction and for putting the paper on the program. So I don't think I need to say a lot on the motivation for this paper. We have seen how recent events have highlighted the importance of sectoral shocks for the inflation dynamics, in particular the inflation dynamics that we've seen after the pandemic. And I think by now we have a good understanding of how first moment shocks transmit through production networks. There's a lot of work that has been done and that continues to be done. See Michelle's presentation, for example, and how these shocks create aggregate fluctuations. We want to switch the focus a little bit on an angle that hasn't been studied so much, which is how supply chains transmit the effect of another type of shock, which are uncertainty shocks or second moment shocks. While this is highly debated in policy circles and financial circles, for instance, what is the implication for supply chains of sector-specific trade tensions, financial instabilities, or even regulatory changes, we don't have a lot of evidence of how this uncertainty propagates through production network and what are the aggregate effects. So we're going to try to fill in this gap in this paper, both empirically and theoretically, by trying to answer questions such as, how does uncertainty that spurs in a particular sector of the economy affect production, prices, and uncertainty also elsewhere in the network in connected industries? And what are the macroeconomic effects of this uncertainty, and are they dependent on where this uncertainty started to begin with? Let me say in advance that this is answering this question is quite challenging because, of course, any sorts of aggregate uncertainty that you may imagine using to answer these questions will not work because aggregate uncertainty contemporaneously affects different sectors of the economy and would not allow you to trace the effects of sectors of shocks through the network. So our first challenge that we need to overcome is to construct sectoral measures of uncertainty, and we're going to do that using option microdata that are available for all the options that are traded on US exchanges on this beautiful data set called option metrics. We're going to construct uncertainty measures at the most fine level that we can, which is NAICS 4-digit. This is the most disaggregated level at which we have consistent data on employment, prices, and input-output linkages. And of course, then we're going to need to identify variation in this uncertainty that we can use as true shocks. So this is going to be uncertainty that is orthogonal to first moment shocks and to uncertainty that arises in connected sector. So the first challenge is familiar to anyone who has worked on uncertainty, how difficult it is to disentangle uncertainty from first moment shocks. But the second challenge is our own challenge when we think about uncertainty having a more granular sort of origin. So with that, we're going to estimate dynamic responses of employment and prices to these shocks to see how this uncertainty affects the industry where it arises, but also other industries that are connected in the supply chain. And we're going to study also its aggregate effect. Finally, we're going to build a new Keynesian production network model with time-varying sectoral uncertainty to interpret the results that we see in the data. Let me preview my results and hopefully I can get to all of them. So higher uncertainty we find is contractionary and inflationary in the sector where it originates. So employment falls, but producer prices in that industry go up. The effects of these shocks are not confined to that sector, but they propagate through the supply chain and in asymmetric ways. First of all, uncertainty in one sector creates uncertainty also in upstream and downstream industries. And on top of that, uncertainty propagates upstream like a negative demand shock, whereas it propagates downstream like a negative supply shock. What I mean by that is that when uncertainty increases in one sector, the suppliers of that sector experience a fall in employment and a fall in prices, as if hit by a negative demand shock. Whereas the customer industries of that industry affected by the uncertainty shock instead experience a fall in employment but an increase in prices, as if hit by a negative supply shock. At the aggregate level, these shocks are contractionary, but I guess most crucially for this conference, they're going to be inflationary only to the extent that they arise in upstream industries. And this highlights how central bankers that want to tackle the effect of uncertainty shock need to take into account the network dimension of the shocks. On the theory is going to highlight how production linkages are essential to understand the upward and downward propagation of the shocks as well as its aggregate effect, because what production linkages do is to translate changes in input demand and in marginal cost into changes in demand or cost for suppliers and customer. And it's also going to reassure us that this type of effects arise both when this uncertainty is on the supply side or on the demand side of the industry. So we touch on, I think we are at the intersection of two literatures, one that studies the effect of time-varying uncertainty, but we take a more granular perspective on this, which allows us to study the network propagation of the shocks. There is, of course, a large and always expanding literature that studies the macro implication of production networks, but so far, not so much work has been done on the propagation of second moment shocks, so we hope we can inform that discussion. There are a few papers out there on sectoral or the production network of network dimensions of uncertainty. I think what we bring to the table is a high frequency identification of sectoral shocks that can really tell us how these shocks propagate through the network, and then evaluate that through the lens of a New Keynesian model. So without further ado, let me get into the data and our empirical results, and then a few words on the model. So the data that we use is firm level implied volatility of US stock options that are issued between 1996 and 2009. If you're not too familiar with IV, this is the conditional variance of stock returns over the life of the option. This is a measure of uncertainty that is fairly well known and used in the uncertainty literature. It's a forward-looking measure of uncertainty. It's available at high frequency. And for this particular project, we also found out that it's got extensive sectoral coverage at the next 4 digit, which allows us to do the analysis that we want to do over here. Let me stress that option implied volatility is different from realized volatility, which instead reflects past changes in stock prices, and it's more closely related to first moment shocks. I'm going to exploit this idea to try to disentangle the effects of first moment shocks. We're going to focus on all the options that are equity-based at the money with 30 days maturities, because these are the most liquid options that we have in our data set. And I'm going to constrain the sample in some ways to make sure that these options are representative of the sectors. But in the end, I'm going to work with 6,300 firms that are going to cover over 100 industries, about 120. So I'm going to have a lot of sectors that I can work with. My sectoral level of uncertainty is going to be, as baseline, a weighted average of the implied volatilities across firms within a given sector. You can see the formula here, where the weights are given by the previous month market cap share of that firm within the sector. So the idea here is that we want to capture the common uncertainty that affects these firms within a given sector, by also taking into account the disproportionate impact of large firms within a sector. We obtain very similar results if we use previous year sales share, and we have also alternatively tried to use the first principal component or a time fixed effect within an industry, and results stay quite similar. This is something that I can construct at the daily level. We're going to go to the monthly level by taking the last 5 trading days of the month average of this measure. So think of this as really the end of the month implied volatility for that particular sector. And we're going to define analogously a measure of realized volatility over the month by using realized square returns for the firms in a sector. Here's a few properties of these measures that I constructed. The top panel is basically showing you how much the sectoral measure that we have constructed explains of time variation of firm level implied volatility of firms within a given sector. So this is the R squared of regressing firm level implied volatility on a sectoral measure. As you can see, our measure explains over 2/3 of this variation when we don't control for aggregate implied volatility. Of course, when we add that control, the explanatory power drops to some extent, but we still can explain at least 25% of this variation. So this is the sense in which our measure is a good representation of a common component of implied volatility of firms within an IX4 digit. In terms of how it behaves, this series behave over the business cycle, you can see that there is a strong correlation with aggregate uncertainty on average. There is a mild negative correlation with industrial production that varies across different sectors. At the 10th percentile, it's minus 30%, and it's almost zero at the 90th percentile. And then it's basically not really correlated with inflation, although some industries are a little bit on the left or on the right of the zero. These measures are also correlated pairwise to 0.87%. So that tells you that there is co-movement across this series, but there is still some part that is idiosyncratic to each sector. That's the part that we're going to try to exploit in our empirical analysis. So what we would like to do would be to run local projection of the following type, where we regress outcomes such as employment and prices on these measures of uncertainty. But of course, these measures are endogenous. They can respond to sector-specific or even aggregate first-moment shocks. Think about when commodity price rises, that by itself increases uncertainty in industries that are energy intensive. So that's something we'll need to deal with. But given the sectoral dimension, we're going to have to deal with the fact that uncertainty could rise elsewhere in the production network, in supplier and customer industries, and there's also movement in aggregate uncertainty. So the first thing that I want to do is try to control for supplier and customer industries uncertainty. The way that I do this is by combining the uncertainty measures that I have for my industries with the total requirement input-output tables. So I'm following the Acemoglu playbook here in defining supplier uncertainty as being a weighted average of the uncertainty of the industries from which I take intermediate inputs. And these are going to be weighted by the fraction of output that I source from that particular intermediate in its Leontief inverse form to capture also indirect linkages. Similarly, I'm going to construct customer uncertainty for industry I as a weighted average of the uncertainty from the industries that use my own output, and it's going to be weighted by the output, the fraction of output that is demanded by those industries. So here is our first stage regression that is basically going to take that measure of uncertainty that I have constructed before. And the idea here is going to be to try to control for all those confounding factors that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and basically extract this residual new IT, which is going to be our sectoral uncertainty shock. So we're going to try to control for first moment shocks by controlling for realized volatility, not only at the sector level, but also in the suppliers and customers of the industry in question. This is exploiting the identification of Berger, Dubecker, and Giglio that say that realized volatility is reflective of first moment shock and can affect contemporaneously uncertainty, but the reverse is not true. The average effect of an uncertainty shock on realized volatility should be zero. So that allows you to control for first moment shocks by controlling for realized volatility. The idea here is that basically when there is an uncertainty shock that increases stock prices, for example, realized returns would go up. But if you take an uncertainty shock that does the opposite, that lowers stock prices, realized volatility would still go up because realized volatility is realized return squared. So the average effect of an uncertainty shock on realized volatility should be zero. So that justifies the control. On top of that, I can use the constructed supplier and customer uncertainty to control for uncertainty arising in connected industries upstream and downstream. Here, we're going to exploit the timing as well, constructing these measures using the only first 16 days of the month to have the information there not overlap with our left-hand side, which was constructed using the last 5 days of the month. And then I can also control for aggregate implied volatility, which is going to take care of aggregate uncertainty. So in the end, we're gonna, this is some of the data that we work with. We have several industries that are either very upstream, very downstream, or in the middle. Upstream industries are chemical manufacturing, iron and steel. Downstream, we have motor vehicle manufacturing, insurance, and healthcare. In black here, you see the raw measure of uncertainty for all this series. So as you can see, there is a lot of time variation in all this series. That is also in some cases quite idiosyncratic. And then the red line is the residualized shocks that we have from this first stage regression. So you see that our controls absorb a lot of the variation in this time series, and we're left with these idiosyncratic spikes that are basically our proxy for this uncertainty shock at the sectoral level. In the paper, we do some analysis to not only convince the reader that these shocks have good statistical properties, they're not autocorrelated, they have a very small cross-sector correlation, but the largest of these shocks coincide with regulatory changes or financial restructuring or technological transformation, trade tensions that increased uncertainty in those particular sectors where we have identified them. So with those shocks in mind, we can go back to our local projection and see what happens to uncertainty, employment, and prices, not only when in response to the shock happening to that own sector, but also to suppliers and to customer shocks that are constructed with the same weighted average idea that I mentioned before when I was constructing the measures themselves. I have some controls, of course, for lags of shocks and lags of the outcome variables. So this is our key result at the industry level. Let me guide you a little bit in reading this picture. So at the top row, I have the response of uncertainty, in the middle, that of employment, and at the bottom, that of prices. And now going through the column, in the middle column, I have the response of an uncertainty shock in its own sector. And then to the left, I have what happens to the suppliers of the industries affected by the shock, and to the right, what happens to the customers. So here I want to make 3 points. The first is that the uncertainty shock increases uncertainty not only in the sector of origin, but also upstream and in downstream industries. So there is a direct propagation of uncertainty to customer and suppliers industries. The uncertainty shock reduces employment, but increases prices at the sectoral level. These are producer prices. So we're going to see that this in the model is going to be explained by a precautionary pricing motive by the firms that are exposed to an uncertainty shock. But you can certainly come up with other reasons why firms facing uncertainty may want to increase prices. This price increase is going to affect also customer industries that you see here to the right. And these customer industries are experiencing a fall in employment and an increase in prices. This is consistent with the fact that they see the price of their intermediate inputs go up, and so they experience a negative supply shock that manifests as a fall in employment and an increase in prices. To the left, instead, you see that the suppliers of the industries affected by the shock experience a fall in employment and a fall in prices. And this is consistent with lower demand for intermediate inputs from the firms affected by the uncertainty shock, which results as a negative demand shock for suppliers upstream. What are the, when we think about the aggregates, what are the aggregates effect of this shock? We're gonna, and given the different inflation dynamics that we saw at the sectoral level, what's gonna happen to inflation? So to answer this question, we're gonna aggregate these sectoral shocks up by basically period by period, taking an average of them weighted by the market cap share of each sector. So that's gonna be basically an aggregate sectoral uncertainty shock. And we're gonna use local projection to see what happens to aggregate uncertainty proxied by the VIX, employment, and to prices. And here the answer is that these sectoral shocks, on average, they increase uncertainty persistently, they reduce employment, but they don't really have a strong impact on core CPI, on inflation that you can see to the right here is not moving very significantly. But given that we saw differential price movement in different sectors in response to the shock, it makes sense to ask whether inflation responds differently, whether uncertainty originates upstream or downstream. And to achieve this, we basically condition this weighted average of sectoral shocks to be happening only in the top upstream decile or only in the bottom upstream decile. So this is basically only industries that are in absolute terms very upstream or very downstream. And this is perhaps our key aggregate result. When the shocks are happening in the top upstream decile, the response of inflation is persistent and significant, whereas when it's happening downstream, this inflation response is significant on impact, but then it becomes not significant. So the takeaway is that uncertainty shocks are inflationary when they happen upstream in the network, but they are contractionary all the time. In the last few minutes that I have, let me tell you that we developed a new Keynesian model with input-output networks and time-varying volatility to try to rationalize these facts and to understand the mechanism behind this. So the model is relatively simple. Aside from Epstein's in preferences, I have a household that maximizes utility from consumption and leisure. Consumption is a bundle of the output produced by different sectors of this economy. Labor is supplied to different sectors of the economy and is imperfectly substitutable across different sectors. There are firms that produce differentiated goods in a monopolistically competitive fashion. They face Calvo-style price stickiness and a production function that uses labor and intermediate inputs that are going to be they're going to be complement. So it's going to be a CES production. These inputs are coming from the other sectors of the economy, similarly to what Michel had. And every sector is going to sell this output either to final consumption or to the other sectors of the economy. Monetary policy is going to be very standard. It follows a Taylor rule that responds to inflation. And the most novel part of this framework is that the process for sectoral TFP is going to be shocked by changes in the volatility for this shock. So this is the shock that we consider a second moment shock to sectoral TFP. I'm going to show you what happens in a three-sector case of this model where the production network is linear. So sector 1 provides intermediate input to sector 2, and sector 2 provides intermediate input to sector 3. And I'm going to shock with an uncertainty shock the sector in the middle, which is sector 2. So basically, you see in this impulse responses that the new Keynesian model with production network replicates these results that we have in the empirics. In particular, the sector 2, which is the sector hit by the shock, experiences a fall in employment and an increase in inflation. This is due to the precautionary pricing motive by which firms that face higher uncertainty, in order to avoid being stuck with a too low price in the future, they decide to increase prices today. The increase in prices today is going to reduce demand for output from sector 2, and this is going to reduce the demand for employment, which results in equilibrium fall in employment in sector 2. This is not the end of the story, though. Of course, these shocks via these production linkages transmit upstream and downstream. So upstream, the fall in demand for employment is going to come also with a fall in demand for intermediate input, which results in a fall in employment in sector 1 and a fall in prices in sector 1. So that's the propagation that we saw happening also in the empirics. And in sector 3, this inflationary effect that happened in sector 2 is going to increase intermediate input prices in sector 3, which are going to basically experience an increase in marginal cost. So employment is going to fall and inflation is going to rise in sector 3. The model also has different prediction for aggregate inflation, whether this uncertainty shock hits very upstream or very downstream. So if it's hitting sector 1, the response of inflation is delayed and persistent, whereas if the shock hits in sector 3, then there is a bit of an increase in inflation initially, but it's very short-lived. So that's also in line with the data. And keep in mind that these effects that I'm describing here are the dominant one that happened in this model. But of course, in the background, there is also precautionary pricing across all the sectors of the economy. There is a precautionary saving motive that would tend to reduce demand across the board. So that would be deflationary across the board. And then there is precautionary labor supply that would tend to push employment up across the board. But the network propagation channel is the dominant channel. This is what the lesson comes out from this particular model. So let me conclude by saying that we have studied uncertainty shocks and how they propagate through supply chain, asymmetric transmission upstream and downstream, which results in differential effects of at the aggregate level, depending on where the shock originated. So these shocks are very inflationary if they originate upstream. And I think there are important lessons for macro policy design because, of course, if the position in the network matters for the output and inflation dynamics, then this is something that a central bank might want to take into account. And it matters not only for uncertainty shocks when they arise by themselves, but also when they are stemming from first moment shocks because they may exacerbate or dampen the inflation output trade-off. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to Efrem discussion.
Thank you very much, Giacomo, for that great presentation. Now I hand the floor to Efrem Castelnuovo, who's Professor of Economics at University of Padova. Efrem, you've got 10 minutes. Thank you.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss this fantastic paper. So Giacomo made a fantastic presentation. So the recap is going to be a little bit redundant, but anyways, so the paper is about the role of sectoral uncertainty shocks and their propagation through a production network. And there's basically two main contributions. The first one is empirical. So what they show is that a conditional shock hitting, say, sector J, that sector is going to experience inflation and a drop in employment. Sectors that are downstream are going to experience the same, so inflation and a drop in real activity. Sectors that are upstream are going to experience a drop in inflation and employment. So you see that there's a drop in real activity across the board, while the response of inflation depends on the position of the network, the sector, apologies, on the network line. Now, theoretically, what they do is to propose a framework to interpret this stylized fact. The framework is a framework with features, well, the usual characteristics of a New Keynesian framework with network. And this is my overly rich, I guess, figure, which is their very neat one plus my notes. So sector 2 is the one that is hit by the uncertainty shock. And this sector experiences inflation because of precautionary pricing in the first place. So firms fear future marginal costs that might be high, and so they increase prices today in order to avoid running negative profits. Okay. So this increase in prices is going to spill over to downstream sectors because sector 2 provides inputs to sector 3. Okay, so these inputs are more costly, and therefore sector 3 now experiences higher marginal costs, and therefore inflation goes up there too. Okay, output goes down in both sectors because of higher prices and precautionary savings, as Giacomo said. Now, from sector 2 to upstream sectors, there's a lower demand of inputs from 2 to 1, therefore a drop in marginal costs in sector 1, drop in inflation there, and drop in output too. Okay, so you see that there's different effects, more supply or demand effects, depending on what sector gets the spillover, actually, and the position of the sectors in the production line. What I like about this is that precautionary pricing is key, and precautionary pricing is being shown in several papers to be an empirically relevant transmission mechanism among the many that might transmit uncertainty shocks. And so it's a model that kind of, well captures some characteristics of the data, I will say. Now, I like the paper very much, I have to say. There's different merits there. One is the shift to sectoral uncertainty. As Giacomo said, we don't know much about the effects of sectoral uncertainty shocks. The second one is that it clarifies the nature of uncertainty shocks, which are not necessarily demand shocks, as previously thought by the literature. And then I believe that the theoretical intuition about downstream, upstream sectors hit by sectoral shock can be applied more generally to more global realities, if you want. But that's actually for other papers, I suspect. So my two main comments, we revolve on the idea of a true regime inflation view. So the fact that normal times might have certain features that are different with respect to high inflation regimes. And if I have time, policy recommendation in this new Keynesian frameworks. Okay. So true regime inflation view. So we know that some policy institutions out there during the pandemic put out the idea of, well, different dynamics of inflation when you are in normal times as opposed to high inflation regime. Okay, and I see some people smiling here. I guess I can identify as people here, but let me proceed with that. So why am I saying it's your regime inflation view? So I'm kind of thinking of the relationship between uncertainty and inflation. Okay, and here I'm sticking to the VIX, so an aggregate financial uncertainty proxy and core inflation. And there's basically nothing in the sample they analyze, which they also comment on in the paper. And this nothing, by the way, in light of their paper, can be seen as there's a lot behind the scenes, okay? So there's no correlation, apparently, in terms of aggregate financial uncertainty, aggregate inflation. But behind the scenes, there might be a lot of inflation and deflation, upstream and downstream sectors. And there's a canceling out effect so that we don't see much if there's a lot. Okay, and in fact, as he showed, there's no correlation with inflation, but there's correlation with the VIX out of sectoral uncertainty shocks. And so that might be a way to interpret this correlation. Now, this correlation changes dramatically if you go to the pandemic. It becomes clearly positive, okay? That's conditional on inflation realizations being above 4%. This is not just a correlation. I got a paper with Gianni Pellegrino and Laus Sarkier, where we tried to document the different effects of macroeconomic uncertainty shocks when inflation is low versus high, if you want, okay? And as you see, left column, the response of CPI inflation industrial production is not particularly large when you are in normal times, the response to a macroeconomic uncertainty shock. But when you are in an inflation regime, the response is much larger, okay? And that's conditional on the same size uncertainty shock. So it's not a matter of larger shock or smaller shock. Okay? So this would be like a conditional, if you want, interpretation of the unconditional correlation I showed you before. Now, this change, this switching correlation, say, leads me to ask Giacomo and Matteo a couple of questions about the potentially time-varying role of sector uncertainty shocks. No? So, and here, what I mean is what sector or sectors are more relevant during the pandemic, were more relevant during the pandemic as opposed to normal times, and if common shocks, due to a variety of global shocks that we know occurred, materialized during the pandemic, might have taken a larger role during the pandemic itself with respect to sectoral shocks per se. Okay, we might more like an empirical orientation to these questions. Then, from a theoretical standpoint, I'm kind of wondering if we think, if we want to study, say, high inflation regimes, if we can take their model right away, like it is, and apply it to the pandemic. And there's two elements that I'm thinking of here. The first one is state dependence of the price setting, and the second one is trend inflation. Okay? So state dependence here, there's this paper by Antonova, the job market paper, which shows that upstream sectors tend to have more flexible prices, but downstream sectors have price flexibility that is more state dependent. So when there's large shocks, they adjust much more, okay? So I'm kind of wondering if during the pandemic, these large shocks that hit a variety of economies actually might have led perhaps downstream sectors to adjust much more and therefore contribute to this positive correlation between uncertainty and inflation I was talking about before. Okay. The other consideration is about trend inflation. There's Guido Ascar here, so I'm trembling a little bit because the master is in the room, okay? But as he told us, basically, when there's trend inflation price, well, in general, no matter, well, forget about uncertainty shocks for a second, when there's the possibility of reoptimizing, firms do so, and do so by increasing their prices more than they will do in the absence of trend inflation. Because they have to chase this price index that grows over time, so they know when they reoptimize that the erosion of their relative price is going to be faster than in the absence of trend inflation. Now, we have a model without sectoral heterogeneity where we apply this concept to uncertainty shocks, as a matter of fact. Okay, and with uncertainty shocks, there's this precautionary pricing, as Giacomo very clearly explained. So firms already have an incentive to increase their prices with trend inflation even more. There's this like toxic combination between trend inflation and uncertainty shocks. Okay, and so in a model without sectoral spillover, there's no sectoral heterogeneity. I repeat, we are able to replicate the jump in inflation and a large drop in output that it seems to be occurring in pandemic data. Okay, that doesn't mean that there's no role for spillovers or sectoral heterogeneity, but it would be nice to understand how to apply Giacomo's model to this high inflation regime. Okay, I guess it's -1 in terms of remaining time, but given the time Italian, I'll go ahead until I'm kind of blocked by the police. Oh, true, fantastic. Okay, so policy recommendation here. So it's interesting that they have this model where there's a simple monetary policy role. I would like them to use it to some extent to tell us something about policy. And policy is difficult, and optimal monetary policy condition uncertainty shocks even more, okay? But so something that we know about optimal policy when it comes to uncertainty shocks is that even if they look like supply shocks, they don't necessarily induce a trade-off for the central bank, okay? Inflation up, output down, strict inflation targeting makes it. That's the idea. And the intuition is that basically strict inflation targeting is such a threat to firms that you're killing precautionary pricing. You're killing basically their willingness to increase prices. Their expectations remain anchored, and therefore, expectations remain anchored, and therefore there's no problem under certain conditions without particular rigidities in these frameworks, okay? Frankly speaking, in their model, I wouldn't know, in the sense that their model is intriguingly sophisticated to some extent. And so it's going to be difficult to design, I guess, optimal policy. But simple simulations with differently calibrated Taylor rules, conditional on aggregate inflation, as opposed to different sectoral inflation rates, might perhaps tell us something on like the direction to take when it comes to designing optimal policy. Although, again, it's an heroic exercise, I understand, but, you know, I would kind of at least think for a second if to do it or not. Okay. Wrap up. It's a beautiful contribution on sector uncertainty and inflation. There's two main points, I guess, in my discussion. One, think about normal times as opposed to high inflation regimes. The pandemic is the example, okay? And exploit their model to think about policy recommendations. If you work on uncertainty, you get to read this paper. That will be my take about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Efrem, for that very engaging discussion. I'll open the floor now for questions, comments also online. Yeah, please, a question at the front.
So do you really need to take Calvo super seriously for this pricing, precautionary pricing mechanism to hold? So for example, because, you know, I'm thinking, you know, the idea that a firm will adjust its price today because she's scared that tomorrow she's not going to be touched by the Calvo fairy on the shoulder, you know, it's, I mean, you know, in the end, we know that in reality, I mean, it's a nice model, but we know that in reality, a price is a choice, and, you know, choosing, you know, changing your price is a choice. So, you know, what would happen if I had a menu cost model in mind, for example, like, you know, if you change your price today because you're scared, then you might anticipate that tomorrow you're going to have to change your price again if you were wrong to be scared. So you will end up paying like a double menu cost. So, you know, might be that actually firms decide not to adjust their prices. So, you know, is the Calvo assumption crucial? How do you think about it?
Another question at the middle.
I love how option pricing is making its way into macro. One might think that when you use option implied volatility, you're masking the effect of uncertainty because options incorporate a risk adjustment as they're priced under the Q measure. So we know that this is a problem, for instance, for the VIX that incorporates a part that we call risk aversion. This is commonly measured as with the variance risk premium. So if you think that risk aversion in firm level options doesn't vary over time, then you're safe. If you think that maybe investors, the marginal investors in these firm level options have different levels of risk aversion across firms, then taking the principal components of these volatilities is fine. You get an aggregate or sectoral level of measure of uncertainty. If this is not the case, though, you might get into trouble, and some of the results might mask indeed the effect of a risk aversion shock. How are you thinking about it? I'm thinking, typically people construct forward-looking measures of volatility under the P measure by just forecasting realized volatility. This might be something that you can do also for with firm level options. Thank you.
Perhaps I can start addressing some of this very interesting question. Regarding the Calvo assumption, Jean-Paul, so it's I think we know from the literature that the strength of this precautionary pricing depends quite a bit on that. So if you have a model with, say, Rothenberg adjustment, then the precautionary pricing is going to be different, typically not as strong. It depends on the monetary policy rule as well. So so the strength of that channel depends on the Calvo assumption. What would happen in a Calvo in a menu cost model? I followed your reasoning. I think you're on the right track, but I would need to think a bit more on that to see exactly what would happen, and it's putting it into the model would be, I think, fairly challenging because we're already solving this model to third order in order to be able to get the effects of uncertainty. So having that extra also non-linearity in there would be challenging, but I think it's a good question, and I can say that as Efrem mentioned, there is evidence in the literature for this precautionary pricing motive, which is the reason why we decided to go that way. But there are also other stories that one can come up with to justify the increase in the prices when uncertainty goes up. Think about stories of financial frictions where when there is a higher uncertainty in a sector, perhaps external financing becomes more expensive, and then these firms might want to pass on that increase in the cost of financing to their customers. So that would be sort of the Gilchrist way of thinking about it. Coming to the question about options, I'm happy to bring options to the macro crowd, but I'm also a macroeconomist, so I'm also learning about options as I go through the process. I spent some time on this idea of the risk premium. So you have anticipated part of my answer, which is that if this risk premium is constant or basically constant across different sectors, then what we're doing is fine. The concern is, of course, if it's time varying. And I think so far what we can say is that we have a series of controls in this first stage regression that includes realized volatility in that sector. We have aggregate uncertainty there with a sector-specific coefficient. All these coefficients are sector-specific. So to the extent that this time variation correlates with some of the controls that we have in that regression, namely realized volatility and sector-specific or aggregate uncertainty, then we would be taking care of that. But I'm happy to talk more offline of other ways of taking care of that. Yeah, and coming to Efrem's a beautiful discussion. Thank you so much. I think the thinking about the state-dependent effect of uncertainty and high inflation regime versus low inflation is a great suggestion that we can explore both empirically and theoretically. Empirically, there is a lot of we can do with this local projection framework, just concentrating on certain states. But I also want to stress that our uncertainty shocks are showing that uncertainty itself has very different implications for inflation. So I think here one has to be very careful when one wants to establish the causal effects, because is it the uncertainty that's generating different inflation regimes, or the other way around? It's I don't think it's an easy question to answer, but it's certainly a worthwhile one to explore. In the model, we can certainly talk to Guido for introducing trend inflation. I haven't gone that far yet, but the policy exercise to think about different Taylor rules and how that would affect the propagation of the shocks is certainly something that we can manage even with the current technology. Let me say that different, like you brought up some intuition that, of course, if you have inflation targeting and you kind of kill this precautionary pricing motive, so in a representative agent, a representative firm economy, this is all fine. Of course, here I think things will be more complicated, because not only targeting the aggregate inflation is not necessarily going to prevent firms in a particular sector of the economy from adjusting their prices. And if they do that, then this whole upstream and downstream propagation begins. So I think the picture is going to be more complicated there, also in terms of what happens to the output in all these different sectors. So let me see if there are more questions. Guido? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to talk about trend inflation, about this uncertainty shock at sectorial level. No, when I saw many of these papers about uncertainty shock, usually there is a slide or a figure with some narrative interpretation spikes. So I just wonder if you have some external validation of these shocks. So there must be, you have a lot of sectors, but at least some of these spikes that you can put some narratives to externally validate what they are, because in my mind that is a bit difficult to figure out. Thanks.
Yes, so we do some of this in the paper. So this was a short presentation. I didn't have too much time to do that, but yeah, we investigate some of these large spikes, and some of them are associated with, for example, regulatory changes that are very industry specific. So, for example, there is a case in the insurance industry where there was a ruling by the New York attorney who basically declared as fraudulent some of the ways of compensating agents that these insurances were using. And you can see, because then we can go firm by firm and see what happens to their option implied volatility. We see this spike as basically each of these firms is basically backing off from this type of payments to their agents in the future. And this basically increases uncertainty about their whole business model, because a lot of it was basically centered around this. We have this, we have a few other cases. It's a bit difficult to be exhaustive here because we have over 100 series and we cannot just do 140 graphs with dates, but I think, yeah, we should I think it's a good suggestion to bring up at least a few examples to convince the audience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Giacomo. I think if there's no other questions in the room, maybe I just ask one quick question. I was interested because you look at employment and inflation. You don't consider wage setting dynamics in the model, or do you? And I'm just wondering how that would potentially change your results, because I'm thinking of even examples in the euro area of certain sectors who are, say, the auto industry hit by inflationary shocks, and maybe then workers are more willing to, let's say, take a real wage cut in exchange for maybe job security. So I'm just wondering, have you considered that as a channel when you're looking at employment and inflation?
No, but that's a great suggestion. We basically put in the model so far, I think, the minimal set of the ingredients that we needed to explain the empirics. This precautionary pricing is the reason why these uncertainty shocks have any real effect in the model. because the model has no capital. There is no forward-looking decision other than price setting, given the nominal rigidity. But I think it's very interesting to consider also, as we explore the model a little more, the effect of different wage setting and how that could shape the transmission of the shocks. So thank you.